to this event, the Helen Kanzira Memorial Lecture. And you will see that some of our seats are still empty because people are caught up with rain, but we hope that they'll join us as we go along. But it's still nice that we are an intimate group. I hope that the lecture will be memorable for every one of us who is attending. I would like to take this opportunity to invite Professor Stefiszyn Burton, who is the Vice-Rector in charge of research and postgraduate studies, to give a welcome on behalf of the university. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. And thank you very much for the introduction, and may I welcome you all to the University of Pretoria, to this lecture, and for those of you who are new visitors to the university, particularly to this campus. This is the annual Helen Kanzira lecture, and I would especially like to welcome Mr. Ernest Wiltshire, who is the widower of Helen Kanzira, and to say we're very honoured that you are with us this evening. The lecture that we're going to hear tonight has the title The Power of Advocacy. Matthew Kaplan, who worked for the US Congress for many years, explained advocacy this way. He said, advocacy in democracy is about getting what you want out of the government. In a democracy, which is a collection of voices, it's everyone's job to use their voice to remind the government of what the people need. So, the role of advocacy is to help governments and policymakers think about what it is that people really need and what really needs to be done to improve social and economic conditions. Advocacy aims to help them understand why things are not working and to provide information and tools that will help to avoid socio-economic disarray or the worsening of social ills. Recognition of challenges in the areas of socio-economic need are embedded in the University of Pretoria's strategic plan. We call it UP 2025 because that's where we hope it will take us. In identifying the imperatives within which the university must operate and shape its future, our plan sets out several conditions around which advocacy, based on sound research findings, has potentially influential roles to play. These include limited public sector capacity, persisting social and economic inequalities, high unemployment, high levels of poverty and inequality, and an education system which needs change. Aligned with these contextual conditions, the university's vision is to be a leading research-intensive university in Africa, generating powerful knowledge and making a positive difference locally and globally. Going further, the plan recognizes that one of its major academic challenges is to combine the characteristics of being research-intensive with having social impact, qualities that combine ideally in the strategies of advocacy. And these match up to the University of Pretoria's critical value, in which we say we commit ourselves in our plan to harnessing our intellectual abilities in the interests of our nation and humanity. No one organisation can apply such strategies on its own, of course, and the university recognises that bringing about change means playing its role in ways that empower other organisations and institutions to use what it produces as part of the larger programme for change and development. The UP 2025 plan spells out the importance for the university of working collaboratively with industry, civil society and government to address the needs of South African and regional societies. In this light, it really is my honour to welcome Mr. Stephen Lewis, who is our speaker this evening. In his address, he will have the opportunity to move this theme into global arenas where the fight for social justice and rights of different sorts, global health, gender equality, are played out in encounters on a daily basis, and where new knowledge as the foundation for advocacy is also needed on a daily basis. Mr. Lewis is the co-founder of the AIDS-Free World, and he has worked with the United Nations for many years in numerous roles, as you will hear when he is formally introduced. On a day when our nation is remembering sadly the very recent passing of our beloved President Mandela, an opportunity to hear such an erudite speaker on such a meaningful topic, promising us wisdom and experience, is particularly welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on, I would like to suggest that we take a moment of silence and meditation, perhaps, to consider the passing of Madiba and to mark that event before we proceed with the rest of this evening. May I ask for a moment's silence? Thank you. Thank you very much for being here with us. I'm sure we're going to have a most interesting lecture now. Mr. Lewis, thank you very much for joining us to speak today. We're very much looking forward to what you are going to speak about. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Burton. And I would now like to call upon the Director of the Center, Professor Frans Viljoen, to also say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Center for Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Martin. Stephen Lewis, Professor Burton, Ernest, ladies and gentlemen, partners of the Master's Program, most welcome here tonight. We really appreciate you coming. And I would also like to thank you all for being here, and I would like to thank those in our team at the Centre who made this event possible, in particular Stefiszyn, who is the head of our gender unit, and the team who supported her. I think tonight's event certainly takes place in the shadow of the death of Madiba, as the Vice Principal has indicated. Madiba, I think we invoke the image of a shadow. It could be something somber, but it could also be something very comforting, like the shadow of a huge baobab tree or another resplendent covered tree of the African continent. And I would like to say that this lecture tonight, which deals with sexual and reproductive rights, really is, in a sense, very closely linked and is fitting very well in the shadow that he has left us with. We should be reminded that one of the first things President Mandela did as president was to provide for free pre- and postnatal care for mothers and children up to the age of 6, which was quite revolutionary as far as our healthcare system was at that time. I'm also reminded of the fact that he is the one who instituted in his presidency 9 August as Women's Day in South Africa, and on the occasion of the 1996 Women's Day celebration, he made the following observations. As long as outmoded ways of thinking prevent women from making a meaningful contribution to society, progress will be slow. As long as the nation refuses to acknowledge the equal role of more than half of itself, it is deemed and doomed to failure. He was also courageous in dealing forthright with the issue of HIV and AIDS in a society where there was certainly ambiguity prevailing over a period of time. We should note that his foundation, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund had put HIV support for children living with HIV and mothers at the center of its programmatic work. He was also someone who posed the following challenge to his society at the time, but the challenge I think that is just as relevant tonight. At the closing of the International AIDS Society Conference in 2003, he made the following observation and posed the following question. When the history of our times is written, will we be remembered as the generation that turned our backs in a moment of a global crisis, or will it be remembered that we did the right thing? Tonight's lecture, commemorating Helen Kanzira, whose photo is displayed here, is remembering her life and the issue that we link to her passing. Helen Kanzira was born in 1968. She studied law at Makerere University in Uganda, and in 2000 she became one of the first group of students who studied towards the master's degree in Human Rights and Democratisation in Africa here at the Center for Human Rights. When she completed the degree, she returned to Uganda and was appointed as a senior legal officer in the privatization unit of the Ministry of Finance, where she played a role as an outstanding civil servant. We in the Center and the other alumni of the Master's Program remember her for the way in which she captured the value of Ubuntu by staying in close contact with her classmates and never seeing the expense too great and the sacrifice of time too huge to attend events and stay in contact and be in touch with her classmates on all important occasions in their lives. Helen passed away in October 2007, shortly after undergoing a C-section during which she gave birth to a baby girl. The girl survived, and Helen was also survived by her husband, Ernest Wiltshire, who is a lawyer in Uganda and is fortunately also able to join us here tonight. Helen's death during childbirth highlights the challenges that many women across Africa and in many other parts of the developing world face. Every time a woman falls pregnant, there is a high likelihood that she will not see her child grow to full personhood. The passing of Helen in 2007 inspired us at the Centre to institute this memorial lecture in her name, in order for her plight to be used positively to create awareness around the problems related to the reproductive rights of women, particularly in Africa. We were honoured over the last few years to have had as presenters of the Helen Kanzira lecture, among others, two High Commissioners for Human Rights, Mary Robinson and Navi Pillay, and we certainly are very pleased to have Mr. Stephen Lewis here tonight to present the lecture to us tonight. We thank you for your presence here, and we look forward to the lecture. Thank you very much.
I must say that perhaps to add on to Helen Kanzira is that Helen Kanzira was from Uganda, I'm also from Uganda, and we happened to be in the same class in 2000, so we're classmates. But what I remember about Helen is that she was really a very pleasant woman, and everyone in the class, I think, really felt like if we wanted to discuss something or if we wanted to get some kind of support, we often counted on Helen Kanzira at the time. And after we finished the program, she used to go around, I think at a great expense, I can say, attending people's weddings. I know she went to a wedding one time in Durban for one of our former classmates who was getting married there. And then she also attended another wedding that I remember in Zambia. And then the last time that we met, she came to Johannesburg with her husband, Ernest. And we attended the wedding of Kobina Daniels in Johannesburg, a very beautiful wedding. And they had just come in on a Friday, the wedding was Saturday, and they were going back home on Sunday. They didn't even have a day to show. So after the wedding, they asked me that, oh, Martin, please, do you mind dropping us back at our hotel because we are not driving? So I said, oh yes, of course I can drop you at the hotel. And then I remember as we were driving to the hotel, it was somewhere near the airport. Ernest said that, oh, Johannesburg, there's so many roads, I wonder how people find their way around. And it was like a little task, because after that we went on an hour's drive trying to find our way to the hotel. But I'm very happy to see Ernest back in Pretoria. And Ernest is a prominent lawyer in Uganda, and he works with one of the most respected law firms in Kampala. And I think one of their clients there is one of the leaders of the opposition called Kizza Besigye. Some of you might know him. So if you read Ugandan newspapers and follow the events in Uganda, Ernest is never very far away from the first page. And I would like to invite Ernest, who has been our friend of the center, someone who keeps in touch with us. I would like to invite him to say a few words. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Martin, for those very kind words, Professor Viljoen and Professor Burton. I want to start by thanking the university, and particularly the center, for enabling this day to take place today. I know we're in the middle of another very serious issue in South Africa, but the fact that this wasn't cancelled, it was about to take place, is something that speaks very dearly to my heart. So I want to thank the university and the center, particularly the good people here who have organized this and organized previous ones. Listening to Professor Viljoen, the caliber of people who have come and delivered these lectures in the past and today makes it very clear that we hold all of us Helen's memory very high esteem. The topics that have been selected, the people that have been selected to make these lectures reveals exactly what we think about Helen. So I thank you for that. Now, to recognize a person who dies in the way that we are doing today, the way you have done in the past, is something which for us as a family and those of us who are friends with Helen, touches us very closely. I was sitting over there and I realized I hadn't sat next to a picture that big since October of 2007, being in that level of proximity. So it brought back very many memories to me. To say that time heals many memories. Sometimes when you sit and you are in touch, the wounds come back. So if I get emotional, please listen. Now I joined the nation of South Africa, its beautiful people, and all men and women who live around the world, to celebrate the life of Nelson Mandela. He remains, I think, the most renowned, perhaps the most sought after leader of our times. He walked the talk, he led by example, he stood for what was right, at a very high cost, personal cost of that. And I think for Africa, he remains perhaps the most important export that we have had, and that we have given to the world. He did things that many people thought could not be done. He touched those who knew him. He also touched those who only knew of him. But I think I'll be speaking for everybody if I say that that touch was positive and has left an indelible mark in the lives of many people. And so the whole world is mourning with you, South Africa. Please accept our condolences. When I was thinking about his life and I was thinking about Helen, the most important lesson I drew out of all these things is summed up in one word: belief. And for me, it is the belief that the world can be better, not a bitter place. It is the belief that the end doesn't always have to be as bad as the beginning may have been. It is the belief that love that is genuinely expressed is stronger and can defeat the strongest chains of hate. It is the belief that nothing is insurmountable. It is the belief, ultimately, that strife does not have to be part of the life to live. And I think that this belief is based on three very simple questions. Perhaps they're related to the lecture that you will hear today. And those three questions for me are simply this: what can I do to make society better? When do I start? What do I have that I can use to do it? I think that to die having made no contribution to society is the same as living but being dead. Because you have no purpose. There is nothing to remember you about. So when you think about your own death, because each one of us has an appointment someday, and this has nothing to do with my reference to the whole job in Johannesburg. And if it should come for you sooner than you think, the question is, what will people say about you? How will people react to that situation? Will they be sad? Will they be happy? Will they be different? Of course, the third option is because you just killed your life and did nothing with it. So as we gather today in the memory of Helen, who I can describe as my best friend, who was taken from us 2,250 days ago, might surprise you, but I still remember, because every day is just accumulating. As we remember her, and I'll tell you that that experience was too close for me, it was too close for comfort. Perhaps if I had had a choice, I would have maybe given myself instead. But as we gather here, I remember now, and bring this back to this whole issue about women's sexual and reproductive health rights. In Uganda, it is a serious problem. Excuse me. I think in other parts of Africa, it is still a serious problem. And I think now related to it is this whole new idea, not very new, the idea about AIDS and HIV. So a lot remains to be done so that these problems can go away. You've heard about Helen, those of you who don't know her. She was a unique, strong, very focused, very energetic person. Who was also very bold and had integrity wrapped around her. That really strengthened me with kindness. And so I was made to attend the 3 weddings that Martin has referred to. I don't like those functions too much. They're very good functions, they're very happy functions. They're quite long sometimes. So, but you crisscrossed Africa to attend them. And in the process I made very good friends. Some of these people I met first in Wiltshire. It was when I went to Tanzania. But very often she went out of her way to do things for people that you consider a little too much. But she did them with joy. She had an infectious love. She often did things that sometimes I consider very strange. And Martin has said some of the work that I do. But I remember that once she, perhaps an illustration of how bold she was. One time she told off the president of Uganda, who was being convinced by a group of people to pay out some compensation. She said to the president, if you pay out that money, I will resign my job. I know I'm very small in the government and I can resign my job. And I'm sure you'll feel bad. And I just thought, why would the president feel bad? Because, but the long, cutting the long story short, the money wasn't paid. It remained in the government coffers. So I salute her. For her, or for us as a family, she didn't die, because she left us with many beautiful memories. And she also left a beautiful 6-year-old girl who share life with them, in whom I see Helen every day. So as we listen this evening to the very distinguished Stefiszyn Lewis on this topic of advocacy, I ask you today to just consider those three questions. Modify them a little bit and just ask you, what will you do to make society better? When will you start to do it? What have you decided to use? Because you have every resource with you right now. The answers that you give to those questions, in my view, I can only guess what they will be. I hope will be the correct answer. Because I think the ultimate challenge we have in the world is to work together and overcome whatever problems we face socially, politically, and economically. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Ernest. And I think I also forgot to say a very important thing, that besides being a lawyer in private practice, Ernest is also a member of the faculty at the School of Law at Makerere University, and the Dean of that School of Law is also present here today. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Stefiszyn Lewis. Mr. Stefiszyn Lewis is the co-founder and co-director of AIDS Free World. His work with the United Nations spanned more than 2 decades. He was the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa from June 2001 until the end of 2006. From 1995 to 1999, Mr. Lewis was Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF at the organization's global headquarters in New York. From 1984 through to 1988, he was Canada's ambassador to the UN. In addition to his work with AIDS Free World, Mr. Lewis is a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He recently served as commissioner on the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. The Commission's landmark report was released in July 2012. Mr. Lewis serves as the board chair of the Stefiszyn Lewis Foundation in Canada. He is a senior fellow of the Enough Project. He is an immediate past member of the board of directors of the Clinton Health Access Initiative and emeritus board member of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. Mr. Lewis is a companion of the Order of Canada, Canada's highest honor for lifetime achievement. In 2005, Mr. Lewis was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was cited in the category that included the Dalai Lama, Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, and Nelson Mandela. In 2007, King Wiltshire III, the monarch of the Kingdom of Lesotho, our neighbor, well, you would all know Lesotho, I'm sure. The King Wiltshire invested Mr. Lewis as Knight Commander of the most dignified order of Musaion. The order is named for the founder of Lesotho. The knighthood is the country's highest honor. Mr. Lewis is the author of the best-selling book, Race Against Time. He holds 37 honorary degrees from Canadian universities, as well as honorary degrees from Dartmouth College and Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Mr. Lewis, it's my pleasure to invite you. Thank you.
That was obviously an extraordinarily friendly introduction, but it is excruciatingly embarrassing. It feels as though my entire life is in the past tense. I am very much delighted to be here and honored and privileged to be a part of the Helen Kanzira annual lecture. Both, I think you can leave it on the table and I'll skirt over if I need it. Both Mary Robinson and Nabi Pillay are good friends. I'm somewhat intimidated by both of them, so I feel particularly auspicious in being allowed to deliver this lecture. I thought that what Ernest spoke reverberated with love and affection and gave you a sense of this remarkably honorable and lovely woman. And that is an enormously striking photograph to look at it intensely. And as someone who has spent some considerable lengths of time with President Musaion of Uganda and has never been able to persuade him of anything because I regard him as largely impenetrable of common sense, I therefore say about Helen Kanzira that she is an astonishing phenomenon to have brought President Musaion to his senses. That is a distinguished achievement. I was here at the University of Pretoria not so long ago, curiously enough and in a bizarre fashion, debating international drug policy with a defender of the international institutions on drug policy from Senegal, and I enjoyed it immensely. And I thought to myself then, if I ever had a chance to return to the university, I would do so. And I was much pleased to receive the invitation to speak at the Helen Kanzira lecture. I noticed, if I may say, just a slight titter of incredulity that ran through the audience at the mention of honorary degrees. So if you will allow me, I will begin with a simple confessional. I attended in Canada 4 post-secondary institutions of celebrated higher learning over an infinite number of years and managed never, but ever, to acquire a degree. I have therefore spent my entire adult life shamelessly lusting after honorary degrees in order to achieve through the back door what was so lamentably denied me through the front. And you will see I've been very successful. And there is a secret to that success. Unlike most people who are honorable and reasonable, I simply asked for the degrees. You'd be astounded the consequence in the university audience when you find someone like a vice president of the university in the audience and point out that you don't have an honorary degree from that institution. And you would be deeply appreciative if it was subsequently confirmed. I trust my message is getting through. So I am aiming for 100, but alas, I'm now in my dotage. I'm obviously in my geriatric stage, and it's unlikely that I will achieve my lustful target. I'm, like everyone else, feeling intensity of sadness about Madiba's death. I went to Soweto yesterday in the morning to stand outside Nelson Mandela's home and to watch and observe the gathering throngs who were dancing and singing and demonstrating, as is so true in South Africa now, the underlying motif of sadness, but a tremendous pride. I can't imagine any other country in the world that has the sense of pride in having a father of a nation who is also the world's most iconic and revered figure. It's really quite astonishing. And I was deeply moved in chatting with a number of people about the graceful and earnest way in which they spoke of what Madiba meant and how they hoped the values which suffused his life would continue to form and shape the country of South Africa. Right in the middle of the couple of hours I was there was a roar of motorcycles, and up to the throngs there came 4 leather-clad motorcycle riders on Harley Davidsons. The machines were resplendent and kind of ominous, and they leaped off the machines. I wasn't sure quite what to expect, and stood at the edge of the crowd. And I couldn't resist it. I went over to them and I said, just, why are you here? And first they turned around and proudly showed me that they were on their back. There was written that they were members of the Pretoria branch of the Harley Davidson Club in South Africa. That's why I must mention it. And then they said to me, with a sweetness that doesn't normally attend on Harley Davidson bike riders, we're here to pay our last respects to Madiba. And I have to say, I felt intensely emotional about it at that moment, because they then talked to me very fully about what they hoped for South Africa and how the legacy which he left would conceivably shine through the difficulties that the country faced now and in the future. And it was so improbable, it was so unlikely, it was so extraordinary a moment with all of the people there singing and dancing, and these leather-suited bike riders with tears in their eyes talking about Madiba. It was a moment I won't quickly forget. I had, if you'll allow me to be personal for a moment, the incredible privilege of spending parts of my life and time in conversation with Madiba, because of a very close friendship with Graça Machel, with whom I spent a really lovely and intense hour this afternoon. And I've worked with Graça for 20 years, and because of that privilege, I was able on occasion when I visited in Houghton and Joburg to chat with Madiba and to watch his unfailing decency and grace with everyone who ever entered the home. And you know, in life one has moments that you cherish intensely. And I'll always cherish the moment of Madiba sitting in his chair in the living room as the throngs gathered and passed by. And it didn't matter whether it was a group of schoolgirls or some cerebral politicians or celebrities or just friends from the political past who wanted to shake his hand. He greeted and treated everyone with the same amazing accessibility and inclusiveness and just immense decency. And you can see how that spirit of reconciliation works in person. So I'm really glad to be here tonight. I'm glad to be here for Helen Kanzira. I'm glad to be here because it's a moment one doesn't quickly forget about being in the country at this time, watching what will happen tomorrow, watching what will happen in the lying in of state, watching what will happen in the funeral we can do on Sunday. I'm an undisciplined speaker. I'm a feckless speaker. I rarely pay any attention to subject matter at all, because there's not a thing you can do about it when I am in the course of speaking, except not to invite me back. That is perfectly reasonable. And I want to speak about advocacy, but I want to begin the observations on advocacy with reference to sexual and reproductive health and rights, to which all of the three previous speakers made reference in honor of Helen Kanzira. And I want to say that around the question of advocacy, sexual and reproductive health is a truly burning issue which should engage humankind in no uncertain terms. I was thinking in particular of two episodes from the not too distant past which illumine the issue. I was lucky enough a long time ago when I was working for UNICEF in 1994, I guess it was, to attend the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, when Stefiszyn, the former head of the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, was the executive director, and where at that conference she took issue publicly and in an enormously courageous way with the Pope in one of those delicious embattled moments when you saw the executive director of a UN agency reduce a clerical sacrosanct being to nondescript status. I'm not being disrespectful, I'm being descriptive. And Nafis was tough and strong. And as a result of the toughness and her leadership, that conference decided to pull together billions and billions of dollars to deal with sexual and reproductive health in the world, because it was quite clear that whether one described it at the time as family planning or whether one used more elaborate descriptive terms, the world had come to a halt in dealing with the rights of women around sexual and reproductive health. And it's worth noting today that we've never even reached half of the money that was promised back in 1994, and we are 20 years later. And it is an extraordinary commentary on the question of gender, which I will reconnoiter a little more extensively in just a few moments. It's a commentary on the question of gender that the world has so abysmally failed in an absolute obligation and commitment which it had made. And then we come to the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000, where the Assembly of the World, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, got together to set out those 10 objectives which they felt would bridge the extraordinary and grotesque gap between the developing and the developed worlds if they were to be achieved by the year 2015. And nowhere in the year 2000 were the words sexual and reproductive health mentioned. They simply did not enter the catalogue of priority for humankind at that time. Of course, the Millennium Development Goals were largely driven by men. And I think I should tell you right now that I regard men as a species to be largely beyond redemption. I will make occasional exceptions for people in this audience who plead equality. But I have to say that it is absolutely a perfect commentary to notice that in the year 2000, sexual and reproductive health did not enter the pantheon of priorities for humankind. And it was only a tremendous battle behind the scenes that finally got sexual and reproductive health in 2005, 2006, tucked in under maternal mortality. But it's also interesting that of all the goals, the one that appears to be most difficult to reach is in fact a goal to overcome maternal mortality. We are making some considerable progress on poverty, on infant mortality, on getting kids into school, on some approaches to gender equality, marginal though they may be, on battling HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria, on dealing with sustainable environment, on dealing with international development assistance. But the one area where everybody is agreed we will fall badly short of the target is maternal mortality. And that despite the fact that we know absolutely everything there is to know about emergency obstetric intervention, we know about midwives, we know about anyone who can help with delivery, we know about moving a woman who is in serious difficulty from the hinterland into a local hospital, but for whatever the reason, we've not been able to overcome the loss of somewhere between 250,000 women and 500,000 women every year in childbirth. And on the occasion of the Helen Kanzira lecture, it is important that we recognize. Ernest and I were chatting about it briefly earlier. He was telling me the questions he sometimes asked. We realize that far too much expendability occurs in this world because of the indifference to the situation of women. I belong to an organization called AIDS Free World. I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to tell you partly what we do and what we think and how we approach it, because it is entirely and consistently an organization that deals in advocacy. We deal in nothing but advocacy, not program, not service, but advocacy. And we are a deliberately and proudly feminist organization. And we apply a feminist critique to absolutely everything we do. And the combination of the two, the advocacy on the one hand and the feminism on the other, I think make for a fairly potent capacity, even though we are only 13 people in total working in a virtual way from a variety of cities around the world. And the first thing we did after we were formed in the year 2007, just to give the flavor of advocacy immediately, is to say what the world needs at this moment in time more than anything else is a new international agency for women. And everyone scoffed at the possibility, scoffed even at the idea. And my co-founder and co-director, a woman from Boston named Paula Donovan, wrote a series monograph called Gender Equality Now or Never, which took apart the United Nations history and non-delivery on questions of gender equality. And it was a 40-page document which was not in any way neutral or tentative in its content. And then we began to circulate it amongst a group that had been appointed by Kofi Annan to look at the social and economic aspects of the United Nations. It was a group that was chaired by Gordon Brown. It had a number of presidents and prime ministers on it. It was no small group. It was 15 people. And the reason we went after them was because there were 12 men and 3 women. The UN is constantly talking about having gender equality on all of the panels and commissions which it appoints, and it just never happens. They can't get it through their mind that there are 2 genders in the world, no matter how hard they try. And this was but another manifestation of the same condition. So we went after them. We spoke to all of them. Again, people scoffed at the idea of a new international agency for women. But after speaking to and lobbying hard with every one of these 15 eminent people, much to everyone's surprise, when they made their report and recommendations to the UN, they recommended the creation of a new international agency for women. People were stunned. And at that point, I happily concede that more and more women's organizations around the world were joining the fray and putting pressure on. Then it became necessary to persuade the governments of the world that this was a desirable object, because no new agency had been created within the United Nations for the last 60 years. Why would they do it for women? Why would they do it for women? You have an agency for children, you have an agency for food, you have an agency for development, you have an agency for health, you have an agency for labor, you've got everything in the world except an agency that speaks to more than half of the world's population. So we sat down with ambassador after ambassador, for country after country, for 1 or 2 hours at a time, and we just bludgeoned them into submission and pulled together all of the material we were able to assemble to make the case. And the big stumbling block became who would lead the new agency, who would be the Undersecretary General. And lo and behold, there suddenly emerged from Chile, the former President Michelle Bachelet, a democratic socialist. I mean, to say the word socialist in the UN environments is necessary to induce cardiac arrest, traumatic apoplexy. I'm a socialist, been all my adult life a burying a socialist, but I was fascinated that the emergence of Michelle Bachelet caused no consternation whatsoever. People were thrilled, and so in the year February 3 years ago, the month of February 3 years ago, suddenly it was created. I was in the General Assembly at the time, just getting such a kick out of the fact that even though I knew countries would willfully starve the new agency, having created it, and that's exactly what they're doing, there would nonetheless be an agency with some hundreds of millions of dollars to give it women a voice and resources on the ground that they had never had before. And that's what's happening. And now we have a new head of the agency, who's really from South Africa. And she's making her mark. I'm getting a kick out of watching her because she's not given to all the diplomatic niceties. I love that. As someone who spends his life trying to alienate people, I love to see someone like Musaion who is putting things so starkly and so frontally time and time again. That was one of the advocacy initiatives which which AIDS-Free World took. Broadly speaking, because it's AIDS-Free World, we of course deal with questions of HIV and AIDS overwhelmingly. And here I want to make a number of statements which probably will not resonate with some people in this audience who are undoubtedly familiar with the subject matter, more familiar than I, but I want to make them anyway. We are now crowing about having 10 million people in treatment. The World Health Organization, in its most recent revision of the guidelines, points out that there should be 25 million people in treatment at this stage, given the level of CD4 counts, which should be the standard. So in terms of the numbers in treatment and the requirements of keeping people alive, we are way, way behind. And in this country, where you now have over 6 million people living with HIV and AIDS, and there are slightly over 2 million in treatment, you have a long, long way to go. But the point I want to make, which doesn't sit well with the great many, is that there's nothing to crow about in having 10 million people in treatment because somehow in 2003 there were only 100,000 and now in 2013 there are 2 million. The reality is that if the world had done its job, if UNAIDS, in the incarnation of the previous director to this one, had really been the leadership agency exerting pressure on governments that was indefatigable and tenacious and unrelenting, we'd have 20 million people in treatment now, not 10 million. And it's a commentary on the failure of the response to the pandemic, which is never adequately acknowledged. We're forever talking about an AIDS-free generation, an AIDS-free world, and starting tomorrow morning, when in fact the emphasis should be on the monumental job that still has to be done. And that's not happening. And it's really offensive. And in the country of South Africa, I won't belabor the point, but according to the Harvard School of Public Health and according to your own social research institutions, over Thabo Mbeki's tenure, we lost 860,000 people minimum unnecessarily because of the denialist and the refusal to roll out antiretroviral drugs. It's one of the most painful episodes in the catalogue of the history of the pandemic in Africa. In fact, it may be the most painful episode. But you know what makes it more painful? At no time was the leadership of the agencies and institutions, the multilateral institutions whom we have collectively created through the world, at no time did any of them publicly take on President Mbeki. They all spoke to him privately, as they like to exalt it now, but they never called him on it publicly. They never took the president on frontally that he was presiding over the death of hundreds of thousands of his own people unnecessarily. Not a word, just the occasional behind-the-scenes imploring to the president that he should change his policy. When in fact, if anyone would have the courage to deal with it publicly, I think that policy might well have changed. I regard it as a badge of honor that Manto Chabalala Samang told me that I couldn't enter the country of South Africa until I had apologized to her for critical comments. Those were tough periods during that particular tenure. And at the top of the United Nations, not only necessarily the Secretary General, the head of WHO, the head of UNAIDS, the head of UNDP, we just heard nothing. Everybody acquiesced because of this nonsensical devotion to something called sovereignty. And this constant self-delusion around HIV and AIDS, which makes you feel as though you are forever having to inflate your achievements while forgetting all the work that is yet to be done. Mark Haywood, who will be known to most of you, who's head of Section 27, made a speech this morning at the AIDS conference in Cape Town, in which he openly said it's time to stop talking about the end of AIDS because we're nowhere near the end of AIDS. We have so much left to do. In fact, he had a nice little thought. He said maybe we should talk about the end of UNAIDS rather than the end of AIDS. And it was a fascinating speech. I got the notes from Mark, the outline of what he said. And I thought how this constant diversion of truth results in disastrous consequences. Last week in Washington was the Global Fund Replenishment Conference on December the 3rd. And everyone knew in advance that we needed a minimum of $15 billion. The Global Fund had said it, $5 billion a year for 3 years. Everybody had said it for all the months leading up to the Replenishment Conference. And so you have the Replenishment Conference with the richest countries in the world gathered, and they walk away with $12 billion. They fall $3 billion short. And everyone in this room surely knows that that money will be counted in human life. And yet, the spin that's put on it is that, what a fantastic thing. We reached $12 billion. We've never had anything like that before, a huge percentage increase over the time before. They even engaged in an intellectual deceit about what they had achieved the time before. It drives me crazy. I'm 76 years old. I'm told that there isn't as much time ahead as I left behind. That aggravates me. I was also told by someone that it's good to be 76 on this side of the grass. So I'm feeling a little better about that. But I don't have patience anymore. I have an emotional range which moves from rage to rage with absolutely nothing in between. And I am disheartened and appalled at the continued willingness to prevaricate and to be dishonest and to inflate achievements which are not yet achievements. We have in the world of AIDS an approach called treatment as prevention. Most of you will be familiar with it. It has proved remarkably effective wherever it is applied. If we were to roll it out significantly, absolutely everywhere in no uncertain terms, then we would gradually see the diminution of the pandemic. I'm going to a conference in Cape Town on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, which is dealing with that subject to give it yet another jolt of intensity. But I must say that coming out boldly and honestly about those kinds of subjects seem to me to be tremendously important. I still do a lot of trapping in the hinterland of the high prevalence countries. And I just want to say that, which already know, I should flagellate myself for saying the obvious to people who understand, there's still so much sorrow, so much struggle, so much incipient and actual death, so much difficulty in dealing with the pandemic in prevalence countries. There are some countries like this one which won't accept the new CD4 count of 500 because there are still so many people below 350 when they get to the hospital or the clinic. There are still a number of countries where people are coming to the clinic with CD4 counts under 200. As a matter of fact, in the principle of treatment as prevention, you shouldn't be thinking about CD4 counts at all. You should just treat people the moment you find they're HIV positive for the rest of their lives. And finally, we're beginning to look seriously at the mothers in the process of vertical transmission. Previously, all we cared about were the infants. All we cared about was the children should emerge HIV negative. And the woman was a tangent, was an inconsequential addendum. And finally, we're beginning to think seriously about keeping the mothers alive and putting them on straight antiretroviral therapy, well beyond breastfeeding, for the rest of their lives. The one fight we never seem to be able to win is to get rid of the phrase prevention of mother-to-child transmission. You tell me another disease where the vector is identified in that fashion. Mother-to-child, another way of demonizing the mother, demonizing the woman. Why can't they call it vertical transmission, which so many do, but not in the annals of the UN? And then make one other point. We've lost, in the consequence of the whole realm and category of HIV and AIDS, we've lost all interest in orphans. Does anybody recognize that there are 16 to 17 million orphans, 95% of them on the continent of Africa, who will become orphaned as a consequence of AIDS? They have completely fallen off the agenda. If you read the last UN AIDS epidemic update 2013, the word orphan does not appear. You remove an entire social category in the sort of human struggle because they don't count anymore, because they don't care anymore, because you're so focused on the on the self-promotion of a particular shibboleth, zero this, zero that, zero this. Can you forget whole categories of people? Almost no reference whatsoever to grandmothers. Grandmothers who are bringing up orphan grandchildren, grandmothers who are keeping whole communities and societies together. You see, in the world of HIV and AIDS, there is a whole realm yet to conquer, and I beg you to continue to see it. And in advocacy terms, we won't stop. Another area of advocacy where we have been taking the cudgels to governments is around LGBT rights, and particularly in the Caribbean. I would love to take it on in Uganda, and now I have a lawyer who we can engage. For an NGO, we pay very well. I don't want you to blanch with anxiety. But the fact of the matter is that we were asked to go into the Caribbean to deal with homophobia, as homophobic as Uganda obviously is, as Zambia obviously is, as Zimbabwe obviously is. Zimbabwe has a president who is a certifiable lunatic around many things, but certainly around LGBT rights. And the homophobia is really desperate and unsettling, but I've never seen anything quite like Jamaica. In any event, what we did was we began to soften up the culture of a number of countries in the Caribbean. Paula Donovan, who is the intellectual architect of what AIDS-Free World does, Paula said, we want to use the law, but we also want to use the culture. So let's do op-eds, let's have letters to the editor, let's do public service announcements, let's do demonstrations, let's have debates with the religious right, let's get turbulence intellectually in the country as a whole, and that will prepare the ground for legal interventions. And as I stand before you, I tell you quite proudly, we have 5 major legal interventions now in the Caribbean. We were the first ever group to challenge the sodomy laws of Jamaica by taking it to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We have found a way to launch an indigenous challenge to the anti-homosexual laws in Jamaica and have done so. We have taken the 3 television networks to court for refusing to run advertisements, very, very benign advertisements on tolerance, and we have taken Belize and Trinidad to court because their immigration statutes contain clauses which deny entry to the country to homosexuals. In fact, they also have clauses which deny entry, believe it or not, to disabled persons who are described as idiots in medieval terms. So we have looked carefully at a combination of a tough intervention on the cultural front to change the thinking and the fabric, but also the legal front, flowing from that Commission on HIV and the Law, which says quite simply that this is a public health issue as well as an issue of human rights. In Jamaica, the general prevalence of HIV amongst the population, the general population, is 1.6%. Amongst the men who have sex with men, it's 32%. So when you terrify people and you drive them underground by criminalizing that persona, they don't take tests, they don't get prevention, they don't get treatment, they don't get care, and a contagion spreads. So again, even though this is a long, tough struggle, we have a number of pro bono law firms who are helping, and we have now 5 lawyers on staff, and we are pulling out all the stops in the hope that if we can get some of these cases to appeal courts, right up to the Privy Council in the UK, or to the Caribbean Court of Justice, whichever is the highest equivalent of your constitutional court, then we can begin to change human behavior, but also to make life livable for large numbers of people. I was going to tell you something about the work with disabilities, because again, the conjunction of disability and AIDS is something that has been largely neglected in the international community. I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do one other thing. Back in 2008, we were approached by a group in Zimbabwe, an NGO, called the Girl Child Network. And they said to us, we're in the midst of the election campaigns, there were 2 in Zimbabwe, and Mugabe has dispatched his war veterans and his youth corps to rape women solely and exclusively because they support the opposition party. And we're desperate because what is happening is beyond belief. And we need help. Will you help us? And Paula said, yes, we'll help, but let's not do the usual anecdotal stuff. Let's actually take affidavits and see if we can construct a case where somewhere down the road we can bring the perpetrators to account. So in a very, very careful security operation orchestrated by a small NGO, we actually managed to get large numbers of women who had been raped out of Zimbabwe. And we took their affidavits in Botswana and South Africa. And we actually brought law firms from the United States and Canada who visited this continent 6 times to take affidavits. One of the law firms, a firm called DLA Piper, gave us literally $1 million worth of pro bono support. And we put together a dossier, which was terrifying in its content, because what had been done to these women was brutal beyond the capacity of the mind to absorb. And we felt that we had constructed an ironclad case illustrating crimes against humanity. And we wanted to get the perpetrators before the courts. But you see, you couldn't get them before the courts in Zimbabwe because there's no judicial system functioning worthy of the name in Zimbabwe, and everybody's been bought off by ZANU-PF. So what do? Well, there was one country in Africa which has universal jurisdiction, and that's this country, South Africa. South Africa has domesticated the International Criminal Court Statute, the Rome Statute, which means that South Africa has the right to arrest, indict, and arrest people who live in other jurisdictions if there is the possibility that at some time they might come into South Africa under a phrase called anticipated presence. So again, everybody laughed at us. And we said we're going to present our dossier to the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa and the South African Police Service, and we are going to ask them to investigate under the principle of universal jurisdiction and get these women justice. Because that's what the women said to us. Our lives are destroyed. We just want justice. It's been a very tough road, because every step of the way we've been resisted since 2009 when we tabled our report in Johannesburg. And of course there is the case that is proceeding now under the South African Litigation Center on torture in Zimbabwe. And they won their case at the first level, and they just received a positive ruling at the second Supreme Court appeal level. And we were amicus in that case. We actually stepped into that case and made a presentation on their behalf, citing our own interest where we wanted to do with rape what was being done with torture. And I have no doubt that it's not going to find its way to the Constitutional Court. But you can't imagine the surprise for everyone when last December we submitted our dossier to the National Prosecuting Authority and the South African Police Service, and in February they said, unexpectedly, that they would initiate an investigation. And it was a complex matter of what that investigation would be and how it would obtain and what it would mean, and that's still under discussion and pursuit, but at least we have a foot in the door and we're not prepared to draw back. And I think that's the quintessential element of advocacy, is that you just never give up. You just absolutely keep at it no matter how serious the opposition may be, even when it's a powerful government. You just keep pounding away and making your case and assembling an irrefutable dossier of material which can't be answered. And as a result, we spent a great deal of time in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I can't even begin to talk about what I have seen in places like Bukavu, Goma, and in Liberia, and in Kenya. And finally, we understood something that I guess everybody understands, but not enough thought is given to it. Almost all of the money internationally that's going to the fight against sexual violence is going to the women after the violence has occurred. It goes to the healing process. And even with these spectacularly terrifying and high-level cases and public cases in India and in South Africa, even with what has been exposed about the American military and Steubenville High School and Aboriginal peoples in Canada, and the reality that is occurring all around the world, whether it is politically orchestrated rape, or rape in conflict, or marital rape, or gang rape, or intimate partner rape. For AIDS-free world, for all of us, it is rape. And we want to design something that can speak to prevention, because all the money goes to the healing afterwards. And we think we have actually fashioned something. And we're going to launch it in January, and we're actually launching it in the Cape Town Khayelitsha area as the prototype, where we then intend to extend it to 10 countries. And it is based on the principle of non-reporting, why it is that women don't report rape. Because when you make the assumption of generalities, they don't report because of shame, they don't report because they're afraid, they don't report because of the possibility of vengeance, they don't report because the police won't take it. The reasons for non-reporting, we have learned, are intensely site-specific. For instance, in Liberia, which has the only really active rape court on the continent with a terrific prosecutor, they weren't getting the cases they knew were occurring. Why? Because the police did not have petrol for their scooters to investigate the plague. Because the women, if they had to come into Monrovia, had no place to stay overnight and couldn't afford it. Because the hearings, when they were held, were being held during harvest season, and the women couldn't leave the crops. So suddenly we began to understand that no matter where you are in the various countries, the reasons for non-reporting are site-specific, and if you can overcome the obstacles to non-reporting, then you can get more of the perpetrators before the courts and begin to diminish the culture of impunity and gradually to diminish the contagion of rape and get communities to understand that it happens because they let it happen, because they are largely responsible for it happening. And in order to do this, we even have a major piece of technology, a handheld device, which has never been used before. And I'm very tickled to say that Genby Health Systems here in South Africa, based in Cape Town, is the technology expert that has put it together for us. So in all of these areas, as far as I'm concerned, I love advocacy. And I think it does achieve things, and I think you can keep pounding away and making social change, and there is nothing better in life than the struggle for social justice. And if you offend people, you should congratulate yourself, because they all deserve to be offended. And never be intimidated or taken aback by those in high places. There is so much fraudulence and nonsense in the self-aggrandizement that occurs in this world that could drive you crazy. It certainly drives me crazy. But I'm glad to have had this time with you. You're very strong in endurance. I apologize, but how many opportunities do I have to express myself in a Castro-like phase before an audience at the University of Pretoria, and to do it in honor of Helen Kanzira? That makes it all so profoundly worthwhile. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis, for that. I think it was not only very informative, very educative, especially around the issue of advocacy, but also at times quite entertaining, and I think that's what will make us remember everything that he said. Thank you very much. Now one can understand why it's possible that you may reach your goal for over 100 doctoral degrees. Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor to some questions, and perhaps we can take 3 questions at a time.
Sure. And by all means, I should have said along the way that for me, the single most important issue on the face of the earth is the struggle for gender equality, that there's nothing that comes close to it, and that you can't marginalize 50% of the world's population and expect ever to achieve social justice. So when we're thinking of, one of the great things for me was that I married a feminist, and that had a huge influence on my socialism, which was by and large immune to feminism as I was growing up. All of that changed. And I have to say that the struggles for gender equality are the most admirable struggles, I think, around this world. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned our previous president and his attitude towards certain things. Do you believe in terms of gender equality and gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS? We've progressed considerably, and there's little work in the future in terms of our present president.
Well, the reality is that since Thabo Mbeki stepped down, there's certainly been a profound change. As I say, you now have over 2 million people in treatment, and your Minister of Health, Musaion, is a remarkably able man who is acknowledged, frankly, around the world as being an unusually strong Minister of Health. And I think you've done some very significant things in the country. Doesn't mean for a moment, forgive my presumption, that there isn't more to be done. I mean, there was that report recently which came out in South Africa showing that in a survey of over 2,000 health centers, health clinics, 21% had drug stockouts from time to time. That can't be tolerated. You know, a country has to fix that kind of thing because a drug stockout can compromise treatment for people. But the incredible process of testing in South Africa and the numbers of people going into treatment, more than 300,000 a year, that is a sensational achievement considering what happened in the previous decade. And you also happen to have a constitution which is internationally beloved. I mean, you have a constitution which is used as a model almost everywhere, and the gender equality clauses of the constitution are much admired. I'm not in a position I'm in a position to note the invidious disjunction between having a constitution which is so perfect and having such a pattern of sexual violence. Obviously, there is a disconnect. But at least there is something against which you can measure the disconnect. At least there is something which allows you to say, in this country, we have gender equality. Why the devil isn't it being shown in the behavior and conduct of a citizenry? And gradually, over time, with the right political leadership, that can happen. I mean, imagine if Madiba were still around and still president, you might have had a very, very different approach. Think of it in terms of HIV and AIDS. I mean, at the Durban conference in 2000, Madiba made a remarkable speech. At Barcelona in 2002, he made a remarkable speech when his son died of AIDS. He went public. When Zaki Ahmed wouldn't take his antiretrovirals, he wore the t-shirt, I'm HIV positive, and he went off to Zaki and persuaded him to go on treatment. And his voice as a champion of trying to energize the continent became very significant. And even though he wouldn't take, because he's such a loyalist of the ANC, he wouldn't have taken Thabo Mbeki on directly, it was clear in what he said how unhappy he was with the prevailing policy. You just got to find the right leader at the right time. This world doesn't have a lot of great leaders. No, forgive me saying so, it's just objectively true. We lack sterling leadership. Why do you think that everybody is so taken and enthralled with Nelson Mandela? Because they sense here is a leader. Why aren't there others? You know, when shall there be such another? It's sad. Yes, We don't engage with, I mean, we don't demean or dispute the contributions which can be made by religious leaders. And I think some traditional leaders, but we have not ourselves engaged. That's an interesting question. I remember when I spoke at the first the first African conference of religious leaders in Nairobi. Oh my God, it must have been 2002, 2003. There were 150 of them. I have never seen so many reactionaries in one room. It was really, it wasn't just a wake-up call. I practically had a seizure. And it demonstrated, I think, how much work had to be done with a number of religious communities around sensitive issues, particularly gender, and most particularly gay, lesbian, trans, etc. And that's really a tough matter. Yes? Can you speak loudly? I have a hearing problem. It won't be you.
Some time ago, an institution in Durban, which was based in the UK, came up with a new legislation for women to actually combat HIV/AIDS. Are there any proofs that such legislation for women will actually work? And what is the plan in actually rolling them out for people to use?
If I understood the question, maybe off base. In my experience, there is no vaccine that has yet been developed for HIV and AIDS, and we're probably still many years away from a vaccine. There is more hope now than there used to be, based on a particular study in Thailand. And there is a lot of discussion now. There was a recent international conference on vaccines which suggested hopefulness down the road. But I would be surprised if we have a vaccine sooner than 10 years from now. And I certainly don't know of any vaccination that would stand as a bar to HIV and AIDS. And I think people who advance that notion are largely charlatans. Yes?
Thank you very much. I'm from Uganda.
Yes.
And a few months ago, a youth minister in one of the youth of Parliament actually made a comment and said that women who are indecent victims should be penalized. And of course...
Did you say indecent rape victims?
Yes. He said that in other words, if you're indecent and you should be penalized, or your case should not be considered. And I remember a lot of noise was made by women activists, by gender activists. But a few days later, it's quite a crowd. I don't know what my friends began at, or I haven't really begun at some time, but I don't know. They were saying it should be suspended, it should let go this power, but nothing was done. And so my question comes in this way. What of this very big problem we have of patriarchal men who are educated, who occupy big positions of power, but who frustrate any efforts that will help to achieve gender equality? And it trickles down to very many areas, because to me, we are simply dealing with the symptoms of the problem, but not the root problem. Because it just comes down to the HIV, how will I be able to go and access, for instance, condoms if my husband is not willing? And if what happens when it is to the level of the policymakers and they frustrate it or they shoot it down, like what happened in that instance, because this is a big policymaker and he has the power to affect the decision, and him making such a blunt statement of ignorance. Yeah.
Well, the man's an ass, and we know that. Pretty clear. But then there are in the United States, in the Tea Party, there have been a number of members of Congress that have made the same statements, the same kinds of statements. I mean, make your hair stand on end. And what is most unsettling about it, although most of them have then been defeated or been forced to resign, a couple of them have run and been re-elected. That's hard to believe, but it does happen. It's very tough dealing with patriarchy. I mean, you're completely right. And when someone makes that kind of statement and nothing happens, you know, there's a kind of quiet applause in the cabinet, and the president doesn't say anything. It's very dispiriting for the women. I really think that in those kinds of instances, it's necessary to have a very strong women's force in the country to keep, just not to let it go, to keep raising it, to keep calling a press conference, to haunt this guy, to hound him, to watch every decision he makes, every statement he makes, every penny of money that he gives out, and just to keep after him until he's kind of hounded out of public office. Or you go to Makerere and speak to Sylvia Tamale. Sylvia Tamale is a wonderful feminist and a pretty strong voice in the country, and I have a feeling that if gathered around leadership of that kind with those voices, you might be able to make a breakthrough. Well, you have to have enlightened political leadership. And if, you know, the prevalence rate of HIV is now inching up again in Uganda. It's gone from 6.5 to 7.3, and that's very worrisome because in Uganda was the poster country for the success. And the way in which Janet Museveni and President Museveni embraced abstinence and billboards all over the country talking about abstinence, and there was a period of time when that nonsense took hold, and it may well have accounted for the fact that because abstinence is not the answer, there wasn't enough focus on condoms, for example. And if there was enough focus on condoms, it might well have meant that the prevalence rates would have remained the same or indeed declined. I mean, these are all speculations, but something went wrong. It went wrong enough that President Museveni 2 weeks ago had to make another public statement to the country, appealing to the country too. And this business of concurrent partnerships, where one man, as a rule, has many partners. The whole business of the lack of sexual autonomy, so that you can't force a man to wear a condom, even if you're in a marital relationship. These things are terribly compromising, and you have to have that kind of determined, principled political leadership which speaks to it all the time. Festus Mogae, the former president of Botswana, was terrific on these things. He spoke about them publicly and strongly. And after he left the presidency, he's been even stronger. And you get people like Mogae, people like Kenneth Kaunda, people who are moving around. They call themselves the champions dealing with HIV and AIDS. Wonderful health ministers like Joy Kumampi, who was the former health minister of Botswana, who are constantly raising these issues. It just needs voice and strength and determination. You're in the midst, if you go back to Uganda, you're in the midst of a never-ending struggle. I mean, it's tough. There's nothing tougher than patriarchy. In my country, women are still making 72 to 75 cents on the male dollar in absolutely identical jobs. And Canada likes to present itself as a great paragon of equality. Nonsense. Everywhere you turn, it's the same around rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters. In Canada, this is a serious thing. In Canada, over the last 15 years, 600 Aboriginal women have disappeared, assumed all of them to be raped and murdered. And it has been impossible to get the police to conduct the kind of investigation which such a contagion of violence suggests. And you won't get the provincial justice ministers in Canada got together and requested the federal government to join them in an inquiry. And the federal government refused. What do? You change governments, that's what you do. You defeat governments that are not pliable. Ernest is working for a member of the opposition, I heard. Are you safe? I'm worried about you. Where is your security apparatus? Just around the corner. Okay. But I just think that it's really reminds me a little bit of Eve Ensler and the work of Vagina Monologues and her creation of the NGO V-Day and this tremendous effort to get women to recognize that if they're going to change the world, initially they're going to have to change it themselves. Because the patriarchy is so strong. Yes, sir. I sense a looming presence. Okay, I'm taking it as the last question. You see how quickly I comply with the direction? Yes, sir. From Sierra Leone. Oh.
But the long and short of it, the presenter